Good evening, Section Z. Professor Beck here. We are in Chapter 10 of the Duke Commuter text, looking at the law of servitudes, and specifically, we are studying easements at this point. And tonight, we're going to look at another way that you can create an easement other than by an express grant. And so the authors give us a case over on page 501 called Van Sant versus Royster to illustrate the theory of creation of easements that we're studying now. But I'd like you to take a look over at page 502, where the property that is in question is depicted in a figure. Before 1904, all three of these lots 4, 19, and 20, were all owned by one person, Mrs. Bailey. Mrs. Bailey had a house that was located on what is now Lot 4. She had indoor plumbing, and so she had a sewer line, and that sewer line ran from under Lot 4, under Lot 20, under Lot 19, over to Highland Avenue, where it connected to the city sewer system. The court indicates that when Mrs. Bailey installed that sewage pipe, that she created something that the court calls a quasi-easement. So what's that mean, and why not just call it an easement? Well, a quasi-easement exists, we're told, when a person utilizes one part of their land for the benefit of another. And so she was using what later became lots 19 and 20 for the benefit of what became Lot 4. And so the court calls it a quasi-easement. It's not an easement because all of the land was owned by one person at that time, and you can't have an easement over your own property, but this was something that was kind of like what an easement does, using one part of the property for the benefit of another part, and so the court calls it a quasi-easement. Now, the plaintiff in this case owns what is now Lot 19. Plaintiff didn't buy it directly from Mrs. Bailey. Instead, she sold, I believe, lots 19 and 20 as a single lot to somebody named Jones back in 1904. And then Jones later carved off what is now Lot 19 and sold it to somebody named Reynolds, and then Reynolds sold it to the plaintiff. This dispute came about when the plaintiff went down in the basement and found 6 to 8 inches of sewage there. Apparently the line that was carrying sewage under Lot 19 had broken and spilled sewage into the basement. In this case, the plaintiff wants the current owners of lots 4 and 20 to stop draining sewage across Lot 19. Now, when Mrs. Bailey deeded Lot 19 to Jones back in 1904, she used a general warranty deed. And we're told that it was a general warranty deed with the usual covenant against encumbrances and containing no exceptions or reservations. Well, could she have created an express easement at that time? Certainly she could have. She could have simply, in the deed to Jones, reserved an easement over what became lots 19 and 20 in favor of the lot she was retaining, Lot 4. But there's no express easement in this case. And so the defendants have to come up with another theory, and they try a couple of them. One theory that the court spends its time on is that there was an implied easement created at the time that Bailey sold lots 19 and 20 to Jones. The alternative theory is that they have since acquired an easement by prescription. That's a theory we'll look at later, but the court doesn't need to get to it because of its resolution of the implied easement point. So is it significant that Mrs. Bailey deeded lots 19 and 20 in a general warranty deed that had a covenant against encumbrances and didn't have any reservations or exceptions? Well, it makes it seem like she or her successors are claiming something about that transaction that wasn't reflected in the deed itself. The deed itself purported to say, I'm transferring you all interest in these lots, and there is no encumbrance on the lots. And now Mrs. Bailey's successors are claiming, well, she impliedly retained an encumbrance in the form of an easement over lots 19 and 20. Over on page 504, we're told about a case from England called Suffield versus Brown, where the court didn't think that a grantor could derogate from his own absolute grant and claim rights over the thing granted even if they were trying to claim a grant of a continuous and apparent easement, that wasn't good enough if you've given a general warranty deed and not kind of noted the existence of the easement. What about in this country? On page 504, the court indicates that perhaps the majority of the cases, and at least as of the time that this case was decided in 1938, hold that in order to establish an easement by implied reservation in favor of the grantor, the easement must be one of strict necessity, even when there was an existing drain or sewer at the time of the severance. So back in 1938, the majority rule was you could impliedly retain an easement in favor of the grantor, but it had to be strictly necessary. So this court is wrestling with the question of, well, should we recognize an implied easement in these circumstances? And the court adopts the rule of the restatement. The restatement says, well, you should look at a number of factors, and one of those factors is whether you are trying to imply the easement in favor of the grantor or the grantee. And the restatement says that it requires a greater showing of necessity to imply an easement in favor of the grantor than it does in favor of the grantee. So if you look down at page 505, in the restatement, they say parties to a conveyance may therefore be assumed to intend the continuance of uses known to them which are in a considerable degree necessary to the continued usefulness of the land, and they will be assumed to intend the continuance of reasonably necessary uses which have so altered the premises as to make them apparent upon reasonably prudent investigation. The degree of necessity required to imply an easement in favor of the conveyor is greater than that required in the case of the conveyee. So the outcome here, the court finds that there was an implied easement. They explain that over on page 506. They say that at the time that John Jones purchased lot 19, he was aware of the lateral sewer, knew that it was installed for the benefit of the lots owned by Mrs. Bailey, the common owner. The easement was necessary to the comfortable enjoyment of the grantor's property. And therefore, the court decides an easement was impliedly retained by Mrs. Bailey back in 1904 when she deeded lots 19 and 20 to Jones. So this easement, is it appurtenant or is it in gross? Well, if we go back to page 502, this would be an appurtenant easement, sorry. This would be an easement appurtenant, which means it is designed to benefit the holder of the easement in some land that they own. And so here it is appurtenant to lot 4. It's designed to benefit the owner of lot 4 and allow them to use lots 19 and 20, probably also appurtenant to lot 20, designed to benefit lot 20 and to burden lot 19. If you have an appurtenant easement, then the book tells us that there is a dominant tenement and a servient tenement. So which is which? Well, in this case, the dominant tenement would be lot 4. That's the tenement, that's the lot that is benefited. And the servient tenement would be lot 19. Probably lot 20 is dominant with respect to lot 19, and probably it's servient with respect to lot 4. So what about the plaintiff claiming that he didn't have notice of the easement and therefore should not be bound by it? Well, the court here decides that the easement was apparent, not in the sense that it was visible, but that he should have been able to figure out that the easement was there. He knew that the house had modern plumbing, and it had to be running into a sewer line somewhere, and so that's enough to give notice, the court seems to say. Down in note 2 after the case, over on page 507, the authors helpfully lay out for us the requirements to find this kind of an implied easement. And this is what we call an implied easement based on a prior existing use. And they lay out 3 requirements. First, there has to be an initial unity of ownership of the now dominant and servient estates, followed by severance of the title to those 2 estates. Secondly, there has to be an existing apparent and continuous use of one parcel for the benefit of the other that existed at the time of the severance. And third, there has to be a reasonable necessity for that use to continue. Now, does it make a difference that the implied easement was in favor of the grantor rather than the grantee? That's kind of dealt with in note 3, and the authors kind of lay out the issue. They tell us that there are still several jurisdictions that follow the common law rule, or the earlier rule, that you have to have strict necessity to find an implied easement by prior existing use in favor of the grantor. But they tell us that the weight of authority today holds that only reasonable necessity is required for an implied easement, regardless of whether the easement is implied in favor of the grantor or the grantee. Finally, notice note 4, which deals with one way that this implied easement can be extinguished. They tell us that if the dominant tenement and the servient tenement come into the same ownership, then the easement is extinguished altogether. That kind of goes back to our idea that you can't own an easement over your own property. And so if both lots come into the same hands, then any easement created that way will be extinguished.